So just a few general things. So nitinol is a metal, okay, very general, and a metal has certain properties. So you can bend it, you can form it, you can kind of do all kinds of processes with it. And what we call this a semi-finished product. Okay, semi-finished is a wire because you can do something with the wire in a final component. The nitinol is kind of it's not an alloy per se. It's called an intermetallic compound. But this is very technical, and I don't want to go more into detail. But it's made out of two different elements, titanium and nickel. So those two are put together to form this what's called nitinol, and the name comes from Ni for nickel, Ti for titanium, and the rest comes from Naval Ordnance Laboratory. That's the area, or that's the institute where it was developed.
Okay, thank you.
That's where the name comes from. So there's no trademark or something on that name. Anybody can use it because it was a public institute, and it was developed there. So anybody can use it. Okay. So generally speaking, you can make that metal in all different kinds of shapes. So wire is one shape, tube is another shape, strip, we call this a strip here, strip is another shape. So the question is, and of course you can make components out of that. The interesting thing with that metal is it has two different ways of reacting. What is different from any other metal. And one is the so-called shape memory effect. And why it's called shape memory effect? So this is kind of a bent wire, okay? It looks bent. So let's see. But if I'm heating that up, you see it changes the shape, okay? So wherever I do the heat comes on, it changes the shape. So I can use that. I can use that for, yeah, come close. So I'm just explaining nitinol here. Nitinol is a metal, and it has a shape memory effect. Shape memory means I can put a shape in there, right, like this, and if I heat it up, the nitinol, it comes back to the original shape. Okay? So in this case, the original shape was straight. But of course I can put any other shape in it, and if there's more interest in that, we can talk about it later, but just as a first step into it, any shape you give it, it will remember. In this case, in this version, by temperature. Okay, that's what's called, it's very small here, but that's what's called the shape memory, or the thermal memory in this case. So thermal memory because it remembers the shape because of I put temperature in it. Okay, that's one version. The other version is called the superelastic or superelasticity. Maybe you have heard the word before. And what it means is this. So I can bend it very far and remembers the shape at that temperature. Okay? So the interesting thing is, and I need a little bit of space here, I kill anybody here. It worked before. What? Let's see. Oh. So I'm cooling this down, and by cooling this down, it changes the properties, right? So you can form it when it's cold, but when you bring it back with the temperature, in this case of your hand or any other temperature, it remembers that it had to be straight. So this version here, this is the interesting version for the medical industry. This version I showed you here, it's mainly used in technical applications. So you can, for example, you can make springs out of that, and you can put the spring in a valve, and at a certain temperature the spring expands or shrinks and opens or closes a valve. So on temperature. So it's used in automotive industry, in industrial applications. It's typically in actuators. Okay. This superelastic version I just showed you is the version which is used in the medical industry. Because what you can do now, you can use that as a starting shape. You laser cut the shape, you form it to a form you like to have it, and then you freeze that shape. And then every time it comes to the temperature you shaped it to, it remembers it. Okay? And release it from the catheter. It expands to the dimension you told them to be. Okay? And by this, and you can see that here, right? So you see it, you bring it out of the catheter in the body at 37 degrees C, and then expands, remembers the original shape you brought it to, and when you made it, and said, okay, now I'm back, and now I'm expanding. For example, the artery I want to be in, and keeping the artery open. That's what a stent should do, right? It should make sure. Yeah, right. So you open it with the balloon. So there are cardio stents using stainless steel or copper chrome. They are deformed, plastically deformed with a balloon. But with Nitinol, it's self-expandable. That's why it's called self-expandable. It expands by itself to the shape you brought it to. Up front, you do it in your lab, you do it in your production, you shape it, you bring it in the catheter, you bring it into the hospital, you bring it to the patient, and there it expands and stays there. Okay, that's the idea behind using Nitinol. Okay,
and it has to be a certain temperature when it starts to.
You need to train it that it makes that transformation below body temperature, because what you want it to remember its shape at body temperature. So you have to shape it in a way that it's below body temperature, below 37 degrees C. Okay. So I need the next slide. So now we're coming to the point which the presentation is about. Can you go back one, please? We're coming to the point where next generation material needs to be. So imagine that in the body you have movement. So when you have an implant in there, it's doing this all the time, because your artery, because of your heartbeat, is doing this. So you have a constant bending mode, for example, on your implant. And if you do that with copper, for example, you do that several times with copper, it breaks. With Nitinol, it doesn't break, but there could be reasons for fracture, and those are, and we call them inclusions. So in an ideal world, it would be a pure metal. In the real world, you always have impurities when you make the material. It's always there. If it's copper, if it's stainless steel, if it's titanium, if it's nickel titanium, you always have inclusions.
So this is implant.
This is implant. Yeah, implant. Okay. So in those inclusions, so did you work with fatigue before? Do you have? Okay. So fatigue is a very complex, let's say, surrounding. So you have a lot of influences. So if your part is designed wrong, you see fatigue. If the application you designed it for, so if it's used unlabeled, right, or off-label, it could create fatigue, because it was designed for a different purpose and somebody used it for something else. Could create fatigue. Surface defects could create fatigue. In this special case here, inclusions, so let's say particles in the material, could create fatigue. And the way how that's happening is, imagine you have a water flow, and you have a lot of rockets in your water, okay? And you have the water flow, and what's happening? Maybe you recognize that when you looked at the river and you have big rocks in there. What the water does, it does this. It flows around it, and depending on the speed of the water and all that, it forms a little triangle after the space. Okay, and the same thing happens in the material. So if you have a rock in there, and you have the bulk material which is flowing around, you're creating, technically we call this a void. Okay, so you have a hard rocket, you have a hard rock, you have this void, and you have the bulk material. So this together under a cyclic mode, what you're creating is you have different ductilities there. You have a very ductile material, you have a very hard material.
How many cycles can this go without fatiguing? Is it 10,000 cycles? Is it 20,000 cycles?
So if it's designed right, it should stay for 400 million cycles, because this is the minimum 400 million. Because this is kind of 10 year. So implants are typically set up for 10 years.
Yeah.
So that's a 10-year cycle, a 10-year. So if you calculate that, so 50 beats a minute and all that, and count it up, how many days and hours and days and years, it's 4 million cycles. The FDA is going to change that for higher to 600 million. But nevertheless, let's take it for 400 million.
So other materials will go away. This will become.
If the design is correct, yes. So what's happening with that rocket in the bending mode, it starts to form micro cracks. We call those micro cracks, and the more it is doing this, the micro cracks are growing and propagating, and at a certain point those micro cracks will reach the surface, and then you see a fracture in the.
So what about in the body? You have lipids, like the body lipids. Do they enhance microcrack propagation versus?
You're talking about corrosion here, right? Corrosion.
Based on body fluids.
So that's why you need to do a special surface treatment.
Okay.
So for implants in Nitinol, typically all the implants today are electropolished. Okay. So you're putting a very, very dense titanium oxide surface layer on top of it to prevent that.
Okay.
That's very important.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not necessary for single-use products or things which are very short in the body, but for long-term implants, you should do that, right? Which adds a lot of more complexity to it. But that's something to handle. I mean, it can be handled.
Yes.
Okay. So keep in mind that we have those blocks in there. So the idea was for next generation products, you don't want that the patient dies because the implant breaks.
Yeah.
So the idea was to make those rocks small enough that you don't have that micro cracks. And that's what we developed. It's can I get the next slide, please? It's a material called HCF. So this is the starting. We start here with those blocks and refine the material, and you get this. You see there are none of those blocks there anymore.
Yeah.
Okay? And what that does, it shifts the fatigue strain to a much higher level. So you're getting much better fatigue life.
So 400 million.
We passed that. You passed.
What is this one targeted for?
So people who start testing it, they couldn't break it so far.
Oh, so they just quit halfway.
They just because they
Too much cycle.
Because at 400 million, that's what the FDA requires, and typically people start doing because running it longer, it takes more time, and costs a lot of money. Fatigue testing is pretty expensive. You typically try to reach the 400 million cycles, and you say, okay, great, cross out, done. So the next generation material will use that to make changes to the design. What you want to make better products for the patient. And that's the idea. And making better products for the patient means, for example, reduce the amount of metal you put in the patient. So making thinner struts, making smaller product, going into, let's say, smaller areas. And that's where you can use this material.
I have a last question.
Sure.
In terms of the fatigue, does the thickness and the surface area matter?
Yeah,
For example,
it does.
If this is half.
It does. So let's say every single pit at a certain, if the pit is at an area where you have high stresses, high strain, this will be a potential, let's say, starting point for a crack. Starting point. So that's why anybody's trying to make the surface as best as possible, and electropolishing definitely help. But with the inclusions in there, you get pits all the time. So the idea is, with this HCF material, with this high cycle fatigue material, you reduce the amount of the size, and you don't get pits anymore. And the less pits you have, the less fatigue fractures you will have. Okay.